You're listening to City of Muses on Paris Underground Radio. Welcome back to City of Muses on Paris Underground Radio. I'm your host, Jennifer Geraghty. I'm a screenwriter, filmmaker, and the creator and founder of the Paris Underground Radio podcast network. Each week, I sit down with an artist or creative to talk about what inspires them, what their creative process is like, and how Paris plays into it all. What do you get when you cross an American from Cleveland with a comedy club in Paris? Well, you get this week's guest, stand-up comedian Terrence Wong. Terrence is also host of Blast Off Comedy, a comedy club featuring weekly open mic, improv comedy, and stand-up comedy shows in English. So, what is it like to perform in France in English? Let's find out. Hello, Terrence. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, so my name's Terrence Wong. I'm a stand-up comedian in Paris doing comedy in English. A lot of the time. And sometimes it depends on the context. If you're asking people to come to your show, then you kind of need to be prepared to tell them a joke. You can also tell them, oh, well, you have to pay for the jokes, and that's why you have to come to the show. I try and defer to this because it's a completely different environment telling a joke at a show for an audience that's there to laugh versus, on the street when someone has kind of a standoffish attitude. You have to prove to me you're funny. It just doesn't make sense. But at the same time, every now and then you kind of have to be prepared if you're the one kind of inviting that interaction. If it comes about naturally, then you don't owe them anything, and I won't tell them a joke. I don't go to your job or I don't come up to you and say, oh, you're an engineer, write some code for me right now. No, it's silly.
Yeah, there's also a big difference, I think, between stand-up comedy and what did the guy say when he walked in the bar, or here's a knock-knock joke. That's a totally different kind of process, I think.
Yeah.
So I want to know a little bit about you. So I'm assuming from your accent that you're American?
Yeah, I'm American.
Okay, good. There was like a 50-50 chance I was going to insult a Canadian, but I'm glad that I didn't.
Oh, that's a compliment. For all you Canadians out there, if anyone ever calls you a patriot, you take that in your heart. That's a good thing. No, I'm just being goofy. We more or less have the same accent, Americans and Canadians. Of course, there are differences and regional differences. If anyone were to confuse the two, I don't think that's a big deal.
Well, I don't either, but I know that Canadians can be sensitive about being mistaken for Americans. So I try to be sensitive.
That's their identity, is being not American.
Yeah, exactly. So where are you from in the US?
Cleveland.
And do you come from a family of funny people?
No, certainly not professionally. If there had to be a funny one in my family, well, I would think it's me, but between my parents, it's my mom who's the funnier one.
And was there a time, do you remember the first time when you realized that you were funny?
I think anyone who does stand-up comedy has a desire to be funny and make people laugh. And I never asked my friends explicitly when they knew they were funny or when they thought about it, but I imagine that happens early on, where you realize that you enjoy making other people laugh. So I think even as a kid, I at least identified as a funny child.
Yeah. In my family, my sister's the funny child. She was identified early.
Yeah.
She remains the funny one. Was there a moment when you realized that you could be funny for a living?
Well, I'm still working on that. In fact, I just accepted a job, like a day job. They say it's a marathon, not a sprint. being in stand-up or I think being in any type of entertainment. So the past 2 years, though, I was doing stand-up full-time and supplementing my income with unemployment benefits. It wouldn't have been possible. Yeah, honestly, it wouldn't have been possible otherwise. I wasn't making that much money to fully sustain myself. That being said, I'm proud of the money I do make doing stand-up. It's not nothing.
So what brought you to Paris?
Originally for work, I'm a software engineer. So I was working for a startup.
Yeah, I'm a filmmaker, screenwriter, all of that. And I often get asked why I'm in Paris because it would be easier if I were in New York or LA.
Right. Yeah.
Do you get that question as well? Like, why be a stand-up comedian in English in France?
Sometimes it's not phrased as a question. It's more phrased as a, are you insane? So more of a statement, right? But certainly people have their doubts and it's not unwarranted. It's honestly unproven. There are no comedians in Paris that make a full-time living doing comedy only in English. There are comedians who do comedy in English at a very high level of success. The most famous one in Paris, his name is Paul Taylor. He's British, but he does a fair amount in French. And I've met him a few times and I don't know him well personally, but my understanding is that it's the French comedy that really sustains him. And that makes sense. You're in France. That's who the people are.
Yeah, I think a lot of his comedy is about mocking Anglophones in French or mocking language differences.
And vice versa.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about the first time that you got up on stage and performed as a comedian?
Oh, it's horrible, which is not an uncommon experience. It was 2019. So I haven't been doing stand up that long, actually. It's now been 5 years. And my girlfriend had just broken up with me. And I think the day after, I went to a stand-up comedy show and asked the host afterwards, how can I perform? Because one, I was always interested in doing stand-up. And then I think that was the right motivation. Well, I have all this free time and maybe this could be a good way to meet people and meet women, which has never happened for me doing stand-up. And I'm being a bit tongue in cheek with that. That's maybe only an incredibly small I wouldn't even say a motivation, just like kind of in the back of your head, like, for the people who you can't see, the screen and you're only listening on the audio, but I'm making creepy hand gestures going, but I signed up and the host told me he could give me a spot in 3 weeks. And I did not spend those 3 weeks preparing, really. I started preparing the day before, 2 days before. And when you go to an open mic, it's usually 5 minutes or maybe less. And I had written, I think, 3 minutes. And one of those jokes was an anecdote. And so I was thinking, well, I can make it longer. I haven't written down the full anecdote, but the anecdote will last 5 minutes or take me to the end of the time. And that is not a good way to go about your first stand-up set, being unprepared and telling an anecdote. My advice to new comedians now, I would say a mistake you see very often is that you have a funny story that works with your friends, but translating it into stand-up comedy isn't the same thing, or you can't say the same exact thing and have it work. And so that's more or less what I tried to do. And you don't have enough punchlines. So it's not very funny. And on top of that, I was incredibly nervous. I honestly blacked out when I was on stage, right? Feeling kind of like my vision closing in on me and then not really remembering afterwards what I did or what I said. I had a friend come watch the show. That was one of the conditions. You had to bring a friend. And then I had the friend film for me, not because I thought I was going to be hilarious, but my ex-girlfriend at the time asked, oh, I didn't know you're interested in doing stand-up. Can you send me the video? I've never rewatched this video. I don't know when I will. I think I need to be so comfortable with where I'm at that it won't hurt me to watch how bad I was in the beginning. And I am not at that level where I can stomach watching my first stand-up set.
It's funny. Did you make it through the full 5 minutes?
I went overtime,
Really?
which you're not supposed to do. I think I was 6 minutes, and depending on the show, 6 minutes is like just on the range of being okay-ish. At an open mic, it's really not okay. The host was kind enough and knew it was my first time to not stop me. But generally at an open mic, and I run open mics now, and I'm really strict, where at 4 minutes, I start speaking I have a second microphone and I'm sitting in the booth and I just start speaking over them saying, all right, round of applause for this person and let's welcome to the stage the next person. The music comes on. They have no opportunity to continue. So if I was hosting myself for my first performance, it would have been even worse, if that makes sense.
It does. What is the percentage of people who do an open mic once and then never come back versus the people who are like, okay, I'm going to do this again?
I think Paris is a pretty friendly scene. And so as much as it is, the pursuit of stand-up comedy, it's also a social event. And so most people come back. It's quite rare that I think someone does it only once and then never tries it again, at least in Paris.
Okay. Well, so you mentioned that you're the host of this comedy show, Blast Off Comedy. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I've been hosting shows under the name Blast Off Comedy for 3 years, almost 3 years. So it started September 2021. This was when things were really more or less fully functional after all the lockdowns and curfews after COVID. And so that's when I committed more to, in that time period during COVID, I had various shows here and there, but everything kept getting stopped. But now the restrictions are gone. I can commit to one thing. It started off as Monday nights and not even weekly because the owner of the bar wouldn't give me every Monday. And I had to every month ask him for more dates for the next one, which is, it's okay. It's a system that works, but I prefer to just have a commitment of, okay, you can have every Monday or even every other Monday, something regular where you don't have to keep asking. And so it's kind of like I have to keep proving that I will run the show well and that people will come to the bar and they'll buy drinks. And so that started in 2021. Now there are how many shows per week? It's more than 7.
Oh, wow.
So on Mondays, there are 2 shows. And then I'll often add one-off shows here and there. And they're in various locations as well. And sometimes I'm not even there, actually. I have someone else host the show. Yeah, when you have this many, you can't really host I guess you could host every single one, but I don't. And that's been a really nice journey. When I left my job, I had some goals with what I wanted to do with my comedy and as well this show. And one of the goals was to more or less make it the best English comedy show in Paris by all metrics. And I think that is true. I have achieved the most followers on Instagram with the show, have the most shows, one of the most consistent attendances for the show. Sometimes you have shows where the attendance for the audience can be kind of volatile, sometimes full, sometimes not full. At least for the shows that are marketed as showcases and not open mics, the ones I do are quite consistently full. And then I've had the opportunity as well to book some pretty famous comedians and have them perform at my show. So probably the biggest 3 have been Mark Normand, Jeff Ross, and John Marco Ceresi. The first 2 are incredibly famous, right? These are people who have specials on Netflix, normally play in front of thousands and thousands of people. And they were all really nice, cool people. They were more than happy to perform in our little room that seats 50. And the shows were amazing.
Does French culture sometimes leave you scratching your head? Well, you might enjoy listening to our sister podcast, Navigating the French, hosted by journalist Emily Monaco. Each episode focuses on a different word in the French language, and Emily is joined by an expert who will help explore what that word says about French culture. Listen now to Navigating the French on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with City of Muses after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to City of Muses on Paris Underground Radio. So what do you think it takes to be a good host or a good MC of a comedy show?
Yeah, so I'm going to preface this by saying I have a limited view of what is a good MC at comedy shows. And by limited view, I mean, well, I know the shows here in Paris. I've gone to a few other cities and gone to shows there and seen what it's like, but all in Europe. And I guess in the US, I've gone to comedy shows, like I've gone to the Comedy Cellar, but this is on a whole nother level, right? This is the most famous comedy club possibly in the world, at the very least in New York City. But what I think makes a good host is that you are there to serve the show. And so what I mean by that is being the host isn't about being the star of the show and having necessarily the funniest set. It's about making sure the audience is having a good time. Something that I believe is that good comedy or great comedy requires taking risks. Taking risks means you will fail. As the host, you don't really want to be failing because the energy is going to come down during the show, and then the other comedians who are there to shine have to make up for this fact. I've seen this at other shows where, for example, hosts will try new material. This is something I don't do when I'm hosting. I don't think hosting, certainly a show with a full audience, is the right atmosphere for trying new material that then doesn't work. And so generally, an analogy I've seen that I think is a good analogy is that being the host of a comedy show is like being the host of a dinner party, right? You want to welcome everyone, and you're kind of, if you're being the host of a dinner party, you're trying to build an atmosphere in the room where everyone feels comfortable, where, you know, if people don't know each other, you might introduce them. You're not going to literally do that during a comedy show, but I think that analogy holds.
Yeah, I think the host is the person that as the audience you look to trust. So no matter what happens, whether the comedian who performs is good or bad, you know that the host is on your side and they're going to guide you through the evening. That's been my experience.
Yeah, right. The host is kind of talking to the audience and sometimes will kind of spin a narrative throughout the night in a way where if someone talked about something during their set and then you come on after them, you can find some tangent that makes it, that kind of continues that conversation as you would in a real conversation. There are some delicate ways you have to handle this. I know sometimes comics don't like it when you kind of piggyback on their joke. So you have to be careful about that. So that is when someone, you know, makes a really funny joke and then it comes off as trying to one up them, right? And that makes sense, right? Yeah, don't one up them.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to make a better joke about the same thing that someone's just been on about. So from the audience side, how often do you have to deal with hecklers?
Really bad hecklers, not that often. There are different kinds of hecklers. The ones that you see online, the most kind of viral and famous clips are hecklers with bad intentions. So ones that really want to interrupt the show. This, I think I've dealt with, twice in my entire career. It was like clearly someone trying to antagonize the show. Then I'd say maybe I'd have to sit down and really think about this, but my feeling is that there are three kinds of hecklers. So one is one with bad intentions, which is very rare. The other is someone who's drunk. And then the other is someone that just doesn't know better. And a lot of the time it comes off as heckling, but you can see that their intention is to try and help. They think that them talking is making the show better or funnier. And usually it's not. But once you can recognize what kind of heckler it is, it kind of guides how you should handle the situation.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So for example, someone who is heckling but with good intentions, at least my feeling is you don't want to come down hard on them and insult them because the audience will feel that. They'll feel that, okay, yeah, the audience member made a mistake, but this is an overreaction. They thought they were being helpful. And if someone with bad intentions, usually the audience will be on your side and they recognize that. And so that type of person, you can really put them in their place.
So do you have a certain kind of comedy that you prefer to perform? Like you mentioned anecdotes before. Do you prefer that for yourself, or improv, or observational, or what do you like to talk about?
That's a good question, and one that I think I don't have a great answer for because I think I'm still figuring that out. For some of my friends, they have done a better job of developing their comedic persona. I'd say they have a clear style or, something about their comedy that is unique to them. And I think I'm still in the phase of trying different things and figuring out who I am as a comedian. Of course, everyone naturally gravitates to some different things. I tend to like jokes that are very cringy. Not necessarily cringy where I purposefully make the audience feel bad or, make them cringe with awkwardness, but in some type of joke or story that I am doing something that if it were to happen in real life would be kind of cringy behavior.
So a little bit self-deprecating.
In a way, yeah.
Okay. And when you're creating a routine, how do you do that? Do you constantly take notes? Do you sit down and work in one fell swoop? How do you create any routine?
I try a few different things. So I think everyone to some degree, when you think of a funny idea, then you write it down. I'll also try to force myself to write jokes either about specific topics or with a specific premise. Not because I think it's going to be the best joke ever, but more as an exercise to practice joke writing. So what I mean by that is sometimes I'll take a sentence that's purposefully not funny and then try to write a joke for it. So the sentence could be anything. For example, today I set up my camera to use as a webcam and then try and think if that was the first sentence, what's the second sentence that then makes it a joke and makes it funny? I haven't done the exercise in a while, so I'm not going to do it right now on the spot. But I think for me, that helps me validate this idea that anything can be funny. And so what's funny is me, or that's what I'm trying, right? And that I have the ability to make things funny.
That leads me very naturally to my next question, which is, do you think that there are topics that are off limits that no one should talk about?
Generally, no. That being said, there are some topics that are incredibly challenging to talk about, and I'd say for most comics, impossible. And, it's not just the topic, but it's the context, it's the when and the where, right? So like 9/11 jokes. People make 9/11 jokes pretty often now. It probably wasn't in good taste to do this on September 12th, 2001. Well, time can change things, right? Of course, there are some topics that, are not related to a specific event and are very challenging to make jokes about. So, jokes about rape, for example. I don't think I've ever said one, but I've certainly heard jokes. If you go to enough comedy shows, you will hear a joke about rape. So, trigger warning to all the audience. If you plan on going to a comedy show at some point and you're unaware that that can happen, it can, and probably will at some point. And I've laughed at jokes that were about rape. Some people won't. Some people will never laugh at that kind of joke, and that's okay. That's my opinion. That jokes aren't for everyone. And what I mean by that is it's not that it's, oh, well, that wasn't meant for you. It's that it's just okay to not find things funny and that nothing will be funny for everyone, right? I don't know anything that makes literally 100% of people laugh. And that's okay.
Yeah. Have you performed in the US as well?
I haven't, and I really should. I'm American, and there's tons of comedy in the US, and every time I go back, I never organize it, and I'm lazy. I'm sure I will at some point.
Do you have any sense of how the comedy scene here in Paris compares to comedy scenes in other places?
So we often get people visiting Paris from other places, including comics from the US who will then perform at our shows, and I'll talk to them and try and figure out how it compares. So my understanding is that Paris shows are generally better paid for the equivalent show, which is cool. That when you are a visiting comic, you actually have more opportunities to perform in Paris than you would in a city like even New York. And the reason for that is that when you're a visiting comic, at least in Paris and maybe other cities, that the shows are quite nice and then we'll give you the spot and you can often perform multiple times per day. Whereas when you're a local comic, for example, in New York City, you don't get that benefit. And it's so competitive that even though that there are hundreds of more shows, but there's so many more, there's thousands of more comics. And so you're competing for only a few number of spots. So it's in that sense, really nice where you have some real meaningful opportunities to perform in front of real audiences and then make a little bit of money. That being said, the scene is much less developed here. And so I think there's a real benefit to being in a scene like New York City or LA, where you need to be absolutely hilarious if you really want to pursue comedy, and you'll just be forced into that position.
Do you have many French people who come to your shows?
Every show has a few French people. It's not, I guess it depends which show you go to. And I think over time, the percentage of the non-French audience has actually grown. So I'd say it's maybe at most a quarter of the audience is French, but often less. And I think it makes sense. The show is in English, and so it's not a show for French. It's for French people who speak English, but it's generally for a different audience. Of course, French people are welcome, and we love having them there, so we can tease them a bit.
I'm just wondering because I don't know how prevalent something like stand-up comedy is in the French culture. So I'm wondering if there's a difference in terms of the scene and how interested the French audience is versus, I don't know, other Anglophone audiences.
I'm not sure I could. I don't know if I had an answer for how they're different in terms of audience members. I think I wouldn't go so far as to, well, French people act this way as an audience and non-French people act a different way. But in terms of how much is stand-up comedy a part of French culture, I think it's growing. I would say that stand-up is a more prevalent part of Anglophone culture. Maybe there are people out there who disagree with me, but it is, I guess you have some arguments about where the art form truly comes from. Some people say it originates from jesters performing for the kings. Some people will say that it's an American art form and that the first stand-up comedians. Some people like to say that Mark Twain was the first stand-up comedian, that after he had published his books and needed money because he was poor, he would give these speeches that were kind of like stand-up comedy. But anyways, that discussion aside, stand-up is definitely more and more a part of French culture. We have some French comedians who do comedy in English, so I can talk to them about that. And they have their own stuff. They have their own comedy festivals that are very large. There was a show that came out on Netflix a few years ago called Troll. So show about stand-up comedy in Paris. It was not reality TV or a documentary. It was, scripted. And I did French comedy for about a year at a very low level, right? Because my French isn't perfect. And some of the shows I went to are really nice shows. They have, comedy clubs here in Paris that are really cool comedy clubs. I didn't understand any of the jokes because I would just memorize what I was going to say and not be able to understand everyone else. But it seemed like the people were making, doing a lot of ha-has and were good comics. I'll just trust from the audience reaction.
Yeah, I've been to a couple of comedy shows here in French. And the biggest thing that I got from it is that they also don't know when you're supposed to tutoyer or vous voyez. And that made me feel so much better.
Yeah.
Are you a book lover who's always looking for the next best book? Or an avid reader who'd love the chance to ask their favorite author a question? Well, then you might like my other podcast, Storytime in Paris, where I interview writers with a French connection, with questions that come from you, the author's fans and followers. Then, the authors treat us to a reading from their books. Listen now to Storytime in Paris on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with City of Muses after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to City of Muses on Paris Underground Radio. So, my final question to you, and we corresponded about this in the tiniest of ways, but how do you think that Paris has helped or hindered you as a creative here in Paris, or has it?
It's a good question. I think this isn't so much on the creative side, but the number one thing that I think it has helped me with is that from all of the information I have, Paris is one of the most challenging markets for stand-up comedy to be in when you're producing a show. Sorry to my friends in Berlin and Amsterdam and Barcelona, but none of you know how to run a goddamn comedy show. You come to Paris and you don't sell any tickets because you don't know what you're doing. Okay. Oh, that's so harsh, but there's a degree to the truth in that. From what I've seen in other cities, and a lot of the time their scenes are more developed, and the people in the cities are more readily going to an English stand-up comedy show and also willing to pay for one. Where in Paris, it's hard. Almost none of our shows are ticketed, meaning that people buy the tickets beforehand. Almost all of the shows are what's called entrée gratuite sortie au chapeau, where people enter for free, and then at the end, they choose how much they want to pay. This is also a monetization model that they do at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. But even doing that model, where you can tell people, you don't even have to pay up front, you can just reserve a place for free and then decide to come. It's incredibly challenging to get people to come to the shows. So you have to be creative and savvy with how you run the show. So a lot of my time and effort has been spent on things that are adjacent to comedy, but not directly related to being funny. So learning how to use the Meta business platform to run Facebook and Instagram ads, and not just the one like an Instagram ad, but like diving deep where you can set target audiences and lookalike audiences and stuff like this, and then monitoring like your cost per purchase and like stupid stuff like this, which is not helping me be funny at all, but things that give you a competitive edge when running a show. So that is the number one thing that Paris has helped with. In terms of the actual comedy side, I think the opportunity to have meaningful spots and perform in front of real audiences. So what I mean by that is if you're starting out as a comic in the US and you're going to open mics, these don't really have audiences, at least from what I've been told, that you're performing in front of other stand-up comedians and they're not listening to you because they're thinking about what they're going to say when they go on stage. So it's not really a great audience to perform in front of because you don't know, like that doesn't represent an audience at a comedy show that you would want to perform at. Our shows in Paris do have regular people who are there just to watch, and then you can do your jokes and measure how funny was that joke with that kind of audience. And you can do that several times a week, sometimes several times in one day, and try and build on top of that. And that certainly wouldn't be possible in other cities. I'd have to really grind it out at these open mics and then build some type of reputation before being allowed to do that kind of thing.
Super interesting. Thank you. I learned a lot. So where can people find you if they want to keep up to date with what you're doing and with Blast Off Comedy and with everything else? Yeah,
Instagram is the short answer to that, at Blast Off Comedy. So like a rocket ship blast offs, right? So Blast Off Comedy, or my personal Instagram at Terrence W. Wong, TerrenceWong. I'll post pretty much always when I'm performing somewhere, as well as when the blast off shows are going to be. And then I often will make a story where you can, right now, I actually have a small reservation fee when you want to reserve to come to a show, just to kind of motivate you to actually come. So this is €1. But on the stories, I always post a link where the reservation fee is waived. And that's your incentive, right? You get to save one whole euro per ticket. Yay.
I mean, that's a baguette.
There you go.
Well, I will include links to all of that so people can find you really easily. Thank you so much, Terrence. This was wonderful. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thanks for reaching out to me, and have a nice day.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to City of Muses. If you've liked what you heard, please take a moment to rate and review it. This is the fastest and easiest way to help support the podcast. Tell a friend who could use a little inspiration. You can also subscribe to the Paris Underground Radio newsletter over on our website, parisundergroundradio.com, which comes out every Sunday and gives a little peek into what's on the network for the week ahead. I'm your host, Jennifer Geraghty. You can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. Thank you for listening, and may you find inspiration wherever you go. City of Muses was produced by Jennifer Geraghty for Paris Underground Radio.